Good afternoon, I'm John McStravick, Head of Content at de Havilland, and welcome to our latest live stream. Today I'm with Narmali McKay, and she's a former trade negotiator for the Australian government and is now an independent advisor on trade to business and to government. We're talking everything about Brexit and trade. Welcome.
Thank you. Yeah.
So we had the first round of negotiations last week. We've got another one coming up next week.
Yeah.
And before that, we had the trade mandates for the UK and the EU. Looking at those two mandates as a former trade negotiator, what do you see as the things people should be looking at and paying attention to, and where are the key areas of divergence?
Yeah. So I guess the first thing to highlight is that they looked like very different documents, from a trade negotiations perspective. The EU one was very typical. It just sort of went through, key areas of where the EU is trying to, come to some agreement with the UK, and it just went through section by section, topic by topic, which is quite typical. Whereas the UK one was very atypical in the sense it really sort of set out this trade deal chapter by chapter, and that's very unusual to see so early on in a mandate. It really went through the detail, and then it said, plus we'll look at, outside of that trade deal as the centerpiece, we'll look at some other things like security and, defense and that kind of thing. So it was two very different documents to start with. And the other thing that I would say is very different about the two of them is that typically in a negotiating mandate, when you start off, you give yourself as one negotiating party a lot of wriggle room. So you start with very broad statements and you try to pin the other side down, which is what the EU did. They pinpointed on things like level playing field, fisheries, that tried to pin the UK down. But what was unusual is that the UK pinned itself down, and that's very unusual too. It sort of backed itself into very difficult corners on extending the transition period, as a red line, about not having the level playing field, about walking away. That was I've never seen anything like that before. So that was quite, very different. So they started at two different places, essentially. Yeah.
And how do you think those red lines and that lack of wiggle room might inform the way that negotiations unfold? Can the government do a sort of PR job on it and say it's delivering one thing and actually maybe negotiating something else, or will it really tie their hands?
And this is the thing, that's the point of the wriggle room, is that so you can actually, start here, and as any negotiation goes, you whittle your way down. It does feel like their hands are very tied on some of these issues because the language is so specific that, there's not much you can spin on we will walk away from a negotiation, or we will categorically not accept rules on alignment rules or a level playing field. So it makes it very difficult. And I guess just to recap, the four or so areas where there is a lot of divergence is the level playing field about, how aligned will the UK stay to the EU? And it's not just about today, it's about having the right to diverge in the future. So that's the first one. The second one is about the European Court of Justice. That really puts, it's been there all along, this issue about, taking back control and all of that. But it's now that it's quite spelt out, it does leave the EU in a situation where the UK can't participate in a lot of institutions. We've already seen some of that. And also just, arbitration, when there is a dispute, who will actually, rule over that? So that's the second one, is the ECJ. Thirdly, fisheries, not economically significant to each region, but it's very typical in a trade negotiation that some agricultural product always holds up the whole thing. They're very politically sensitive, and both sides want access to British fishing waters on their own terms. And then finally, one of the things that they're looking at is the governance structure of this whole framework. So as I said earlier, the Europeans really want a sort of umbrella overarching arrangement under which there's a FTA, there's and a series of sort of treaty level agreements on whether it's security or defence or data or whatever it is. Now the UK want just the free trade agreement on its own, and they don't want these other things under the umbrella. They just want to take them outside the umbrella and settle them separately. Now that's a very big difference. And I think what was quite telling is that when Michel Barnier came out at the press conference, he said, I think he used the words, there are very, very, very difficult or decisions or divergences or something like that. And that's also quite unusual coming out of your first press conference.
And Michael Gove last week saying in a written statement there were significant differences as well.
Yeah, that's right. Usually in round number one, they come out, with platitudes and, yes, we're willing to work together. And there are some, they're not very specific in the way they were. So it was really quite telling that things are difficult. Yeah, very, very strong red lines, and it's hard to see how they're going to move from there. One side has to give at some point. Yeah.
Okay. Let's talk a little bit about the role of negotiators in all of this. So you've got negotiators, and then they're feeding into number 10 a lot of the time, and they're having engagement with industry, with business, also with Whitehall departments. People who are seeing those red lines, and they're seeing that as a bit of a red flag, as it were, how should they be communicating those messages, and who should they be communicating them to?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Just kind of going back a step, this negotiation is really very different to a typical trade negotiation. In a normal trade negotiation in the rest of the world, maybe putting aside, the US at the moment, usually both sides of the left and the right in a country come together. They decide this trade arrangement is in the best interests of our country. Let's pursue it. Let's send in a highly experienced negotiating team and let them run with it. And then the politics kind of weighs in on top as and when. Now, this is kind of the inverse of that. It's being run from the political end, and it's the officials aren't really, they're not running it. They're not running the show. So where does that leave, I guess all of your clients or businesses generally in terms of how they feed into it? It's very important, I think, to firstly be really clear about what your interests are as a business in these negotiations. Like, you should be able to find your top 5, A, B, C, D things are really important to us as a business. And then, you should be monitoring. Those press conferences are gold dust. Even though they look very bland, you want to be really looking at what are they giving away, because those press conferences are not, they're not given lightly. The media statements are put together very carefully. Every word is looked at. So, you want to be looking at what can I read between these lines as to what what they're saying, and also looking at overarching trade associations. There's the top 5 business associations, and they are, being kept very much in the loop as much as they can. So really relying on them and what their inside track is, as well as Brussels. Actually, there's a lot of leaks in Brussels, so
yes.
It's good to be.
It's a large part of our business.
Yeah, well, exactly. So it's good to sort of have avenues either through you or through others in Brussels to really assess what's happening behind the scenes.
Is it easy to get that information on the EU side then? Obviously the Commission being the executive, being civil servants, being more experienced in trade negotiations, would they typically be more transparent then, or about the same?
I would imagine so in this case. I mean, I think you also saw it in the fact that it was Barnier that gave the press conference. It wasn't joint. The UK didn't hold one. So it was, I think, the EU is very experienced at this, so they have a tried and true format that they're going to follow, and that includes, how they brief the press, what they release to the public, how far down their internal chain some of this information goes, and so they will be a more stock standard route to be looking at to access information than the UK, and the UK is, it's a very different negotiation. It's being run very atypically, unusually, and so you may not get that same information in the same way. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And then if people are deciding what they want to lobby the government or the commission on, those red lines that are out there, are those sort of just no-goes? Should people be quite selective in the messaging, sticking to things from their sector, or is it okay to make a pronouncement about, actually, we need regulatory alignment in order to keep a supply chain running, for example?
Yeah, that's a really good question, because what I've noticed that's very different in this situation compared to industries in other countries where the trade negotiations are going on, industry is a lot more vocal about their red lines. They're very vociferous. They'll thump the table. They'll say, make it very clear. And I think, to be fair to industry here, the difference is that the politics are so sensitive. I think there's a real fear about being locked out of the room if you speak too loudly publicly. There's that sentiment floating around. I'm sure, a lot of businesses feel that. Whereas because the trade negotiations and negotiations generally in other countries are run by officials, industry and businesses are quite happy to be very loud about it. I mean, I still say you're not going to get heard unless you're going to be loud about what your red lines are as an industry or a business. The challenge is, in this environment, you do also want to, protect your own interests and be constructive about it. So there's certain things that you want to be looking at, what you say publicly and what you say privately. You can be quite tough privately with government, and then temper the message, publicly, depending on the mood and how constructive. You don't really want to undermine the process as well. So that's something to look at. The other thing to really bear in mind is that it's really important to know, why are trade negotiations done in the first place? Like, if you really go back to basics, the whole point of a trade negotiation is to benefit industry, business, companies. So the government's actually negotiating on behalf of its economic sectors. So without industry, there really is no negotiation. And as a negotiator, I mean, my experience is that even when you go into the negotiating room, we actually don't have a clue, so to speak. We rely very much on business and industry telling us, okay, this is the issue we're facing in this sector. We need you to go in and negotiate this access or protect this industry. This is what it looks like. This is what the numbers are like. So we have to work hand in glove as negotiators with industry. So that is the other thing for industry to be aware of. They have a very, very crucial role in not just in this EU negotiation, but in future negotiations as well. There's nothing to negotiate effectively if industry doesn't tell you what they need, which is why they're undertaking all of these consultations. But based on that, businesses have a really big role to play. I think in this country, it's just like starting to assert itself on how much they can thump the table or be vocal and when. Yeah.
Can you point to someone who you think is doing this effectively? Who do you think, you talked about the big 5 business groups, are those the people that people should be looking to if they are looking to influence or gain advice on how to speak to the government and engage?
Definitely, yeah. The big 5 have been in the room from day one, so they're now really very experienced in managing both their business concerns, their member concerns, as well as government concerns. So, they may have their own frustrations that they have to deal with, but they are very well versed and they would definitely be a first point of call. And then, you know, we've seen other businesses, you know, and sub-industry bodies go out on their own in support, you know, with their own message. You know, I think ADS came out last week about the European Safety Authority for the UK not being part of it. You know, they came out quite strongly on that. So those things, obviously, you know, that was their time and it was used wisely at the right time on a very crucial issue for them. So, you know, you may choose to use your overarching umbrella body until your issues sort of come to the fore. And just to bear in mind, this is like, you know, even though it's a very tight time frame, it's still, you know, a number of months that you've got to ride out in the negotiation.
I was going to ask actually, how does that time frame? We're in such a unique position. So
Yeah.
unlike a trade deal, typically it's two sides who are aligned at present and they're diverging, and the government makes a big thing of this. So that's quite different. There's a lot to untangle. It's also unusual in that there's a deadline on it, so to speak. How will that inform the way that negotiations unfold, do you think?
It will be very decisive, I think. It will very much inform it. And you can see that that's potentially why they're coming out right now and saying this is very, very difficult, like round one, because I think there's a marker already in June. The UK said if there's not sight of a deal by June, we're walking away. So, you know, that's one marker. There's also a marker on fisheries being done by July. And so the time frame will absolutely condense things to a great degree. And you can see that I think the negotiating timetable's every couple of weeks now. So that's not normal either. So in a extended trade negotiation where you have a number of years, you'll be doing it sometimes 6 monthly. So, you know, that kind of time frame could never apply in this situation. And luckily the proximity, you know, works in terms of doing it every 2 weeks. And if you look at how they've split the negotiating teams, I don't know if you've seen that, but they've actually got working groups, one on level playing field, one on, you know, the various issues. So there's inside a negotiating round, they're sending off the teams to go and nut that out or come up with a solution for X, Y, or Z.
So those 11 working groups with their separate work streams, is that quite atypical then, and then coming together and...
That's quite typical, but it's sort of condensed, you know, it's very condensed, it's very amplified in the way it's being done. So the pressure is on, and I see that the UK wants to table a draft text, FTA text.
Yeah, in advance of the next round.
Yeah, I mean, that's also incredibly unheard of, you know, for round two of a negotiation. What usually happens is that stuff stays behind closed doors. Very much, it's worked on together by both sides, and then they come out jointly with a text. So that is very unusual to be doing it this way. So there's a lot of things about this that are not easy to navigate because they're not, you know, part of a normal way of doing things. Yeah.
Absolutely. As I've got you here, you were involved in negotiations between Australia and the US. The UK also last week published its draft trade objectives for negotiations with Washington. How difficult do you think it will be negotiating simultaneously with the EU and with the US, and will those inform each other? Will things that they're saying in press conferences when they come back from Washington, will that be watched closely by Brussels and by businesses?
Definitely. Given that the EU is, you know, the UK's biggest trading partner, and because the relationship was so intertwined, all of the other countries that the UK will be doing an FTA with are watching very closely, first of all, to make sure they have a sense of what is negotiated in the UK-EU deal as a foundation, as a benchmark, and that will really set the tone for how much flexibility the UK has to negotiate other deals. Now, I mean, you know, we always say as trade negotiators there are, you know, arguably about three the three negotiating powers that you'll never win against. One of them is the US, the other is China, and the last one is the EU. You know, and that's for experienced countries like Australia who've been doing it for 40 odd years, and that's just the geographical balance of things. Now, the Australia-US trade deal was lauded around as a very quick deal. It was done in 2 years. It was politically a lot of hype about it. But what you have to get about that kind of deal is it was relatively shallow. So the idea of a free trade agreement that it's comprehensive, it's deep, you spend years, that's why it takes so long. You spend years really getting into the detail. So if you're going to have a trade deal that is, churned out in a couple of years, it's not going to look like that. So there's usually a political element that goes with those quick and dirty sort of trade deals, so to speak. And it was a very politically unsavoury one in Australia. Public didn't like it. Australia, now that I'm not in government, I can say this, that Australia will say, that they won, got some wins out of it, which, yeah, they did. But the US definitely came out on top. Like, there was no question about it, and that was never ever in question. But it was very politically important to have that trade deal, for Australia. And I think that's a question that we want to ask about the UK. Who is the UK going to do these new trade deals with? How politically important are they? As you said, the mandate came out for the US negotiation. The US is very, very tough to negotiate with. So, and to do them concurrently was your other question. Yes, countries do that, but they have got a very structured system in place in their own governments. They've been doing it for years. They've got a foundation, a trade negotiating team that's not necessarily large but very experienced, and a foundation of having negotiated other FTAs, so that you're not always starting from scratch. You're drawing on your experience from before. You're pulling in people who've dealt with this issue from another FTA. You've got a very, very structured system in place. And for the UK, that's a real challenge to not just get the capacity inside government working well, but to also be able to, concurrently run these negotiations at the same time. It's a big ask.
And presumably with things like level playing field provisions, it's very difficult to be negotiating with one market which has lower standards than the UK's traditionally had, whilst at the same time trying to give assurances to negotiators from the Commission on the other side of the table.
Absolutely, and that's, this is the standards issues really, coming to the fore between the US and the EU, really. Where are we going to stand in the middle of these two differing standards? Also, on the level playing field part of it, in the EU mandate, they've said, we're not going to give you tariff-free access unless you agree to this level playing field. Now, that's a pretty big deal, because that will also dictate, when the UK negotiates with other countries, what their tariffs and, what their tariff schedule is going to be like. So they're all very intertwined, and I think it was the Canadians that made a comment that if the UK drops all its tariffs to zero in its own schedule, it doesn't really see the point of negotiating a trade deal, because there's not much, they get what they want anyway. So there's all these moving parts that have an impact on future deals, standards, and across the board, really.
Wonderful. Normally, before you go, I'm going to make you a hostage to fortune. The UK government said it's going to walk away at the end of this year without a deal if it can't negotiate one, and both sides are working to that timetable. Where do you think we will be on the 1st of January 2021?
Wow. So I think...
I'm sorry.
Yeah. So I think, really, I think the EU really, the reason the EU will want a deal is because of Ireland. right? So if the issue of Ireland wasn't there, I think they would also be able to walk away more easily. So with that in mind, I think it is possible to have some kind of deal struck, but it will be more like a framework deal that, you might pitch it as a final deal, Australia-US style great trade deal, but in practice, there will actually have to be a lot of detail negotiated out over the coming years or worked out. And so you might get a shallow framework agreement on top line things. And then, I think it'll be a number of years going forward to really make it work.
We can get Brexit done 2 or 3 times.
Yes, indeed. Yeah.
Right, unfortunately, that's all we've got time for. Thank you very much to our guest, Namali Mackay. Do follow us on Twitter. We'll have bits, the full live stream and parts of it being tweeted over the coming days, and watch out for upcoming live streams as well. We hope you found it enjoyable. I found that really interesting, actually, learned quite a bit. Have a good afternoon.